Hi, my name is Farai from the Zimbabwe Monetary Institute, and today I'm going to talk about why money was created and why mankind migrated from barter to money. Before I go on to this topic, I'm going to just talk about a few myths that envelop um, economics. There's so many myths that are there about the economy, and we need to educate people concerning these myths and dispel these myths and explode these myths. There was one in the 1980s, which was very prevalent in Zimbabwe soon after independence, and said if you put a black face on the money, people will have no faith in the currency. Well, this sounds a little bit odd, but it was what went on. And what they would do is they would look up north, because Zimbabwe, as you know, is in the south, and say, look at all those countries that have gained independence and put a black face on their monies. The monies have evaporated, and the economies are in ruin. And the reason is because they put a black face on the currency, on the notes. It was being propagated mainly by people that were pretty affluent. Then there was another one. Gold is natural money. That is why everybody was on the gold standard. And we have to go and say what Aristotle said, that money is not by nature, but by law. Whatever the law says, what this is the currency, then that is the currency. It is not to do with the nature of a commodity or the nature of a good. It is basically what the law says is what is. Then there's another one that says that the national budget must be funded and balanced. We see this charade every year in this country and most countries, where you have the finance minister or the treasury minister or treasury secretary go before parliament or before Congress and present a budget. And that budget is funded and it is balanced, that they have to show what they want to spend on and have to show where the money is coming from. This is a myth. There's also a myth that banks are primary financial intermediaries, that banks, before they can lend money, they have to wait for grandma or grandpa to deposit money into the bank. This has been dispelled by a publication by the Bank of England, and in this publication they basically say that this is a myth, this is not what happens in real life, that banks create money out of an accounting entry. They do it out of a custom that originated from after 1844. Henry Dunning MacLeod did some work in the 1860s, and he displayed that was the case. We'll talk about that some other time. And then there's an inscription on money that we had here in Zimbabwe that says, I promise to pay the bearer on demand. And this was on money. And this further propagated the myth of that gold is natural money and that all money is equivalent to gold, or all money should be able to translate to gold. But money in itself is, you're just having faith in the treasury, in the government. Then there's another one, that if you increase civil servants' salaries, you will cause inflation. And this, I heard this quite often growing up, and this was government saying, telling the trade unions that they couldn't put up the salaries to meet inflation because that would be inflationary. But that does not cause inflation. In fact, Milton Friedman says if you want to look at inflation, all you have to do is to look at M3. M3 will shoot up before inflation shoots up. And then we also have a myth on pensions and retirement benefits. And people say that these should be paid out of savings, and we should create a savings account and do funds which then can be used to pay retirements as they come due. But we know this is another myth. Retirements and pensions should be paid straight out of the exchequer. You don't need to have savings built up to pay pensions if you're a government, because the government is unlike a normal user of the currency. Government is a provider of the currency. It simply provides these benefits out of the exchequer account. Then there's a notion that goes on that government causes the hyperinflation, or government can cause inflation. It is very difficult for government to cause inflation, let alone hyperinflation. This can only be done by the banks and hardly anyone else, because the banks, as you see that publication by the Bank of England in 2014, Q1, you can look it up on Google. Just type Bank of England, bank creation, and as of today, that would bring you up that article, and they clearly say that banks create money out of an accounting entry, and that this is not even controlled by the central bank. And then there's another myth that a country needs to borrow money from the IMF, the World Bank, or the West. But this is a myth. All banking should be domestic. This is a theme that is carried on and was talked about by John Maynard Keynes. And he never considered a international bank. He always thought banking was national. Even if you look at the Bretton Woods talks, his position was that banking should be national. And then there's a view that all the money in the economy is controlled by the bank, which is not true. The banks control over 95% of the money in the economy, because most of the money in the economy lies in M3, which is bank balances. And if you neglect that, you won't understand what's going on in an economy. And then we also have this overriding notion that government with a sovereign currency is constrained, like a household or a firm. But this is not the case. The government is unlike a normal user of the currency. It is the provider of the currency. And it must not constrain itself like a user by giving itself self-imposed constraints which limit it to barter. And that is what we're going to talk about in this talk. So we now go to our main talk, and we'll see why, in this talk, why money was created and why taxes do not fund a government with a sovereign currency. So the original definition of why money was created was given by L. Randall Ray, who's from modern monetary theory, and I looked it up and did some work on it, and I believe it to be true. Money was created to provision government, and number two, to overcome the limits of barter. So let's start at barter because money, because before money we had barter. There are two types of barter. There's simple barter, where parties exchange goods. Now, for example, when ships came from overseas and they needed fresh goods, they would offload some of their cargo and exchange and get food and fresh supplies. And then we have what's called advanced barter, where an authority, either religious or government, decides what the medium of exchange is going to be, and introduces an intermediary good, which acts as money. So the authority designates one or two commodities to act as the medium of exchange. This in the past has mainly been silver or gold. There's a Latin term for this, for both types of barter, simple barter and advanced barter, and its name is ponderata, which means money by weight. Why this term is important is because any time we look at the value of a commodity or the weight of a commodity as money, we limit ourselves to barter. And here's why. We have a graph here where we plot time on the x-axis and we put money, dollars, pounds, whatever, on the y-axis. And the line is the amount of tax revenue that the government receives on an annual basis. Beneath that line of taxes or revenue is the feasible range, is the possible range that the government can spend. Government cannot spend more than it earns in taxes. That line, we call it the limit of barter. Government may not spend above that line and cannot spend above that line in barter. It's a very important limit, so I'll go through it again. That line is the total revenue or total cash flows the government receives on an annual basis, and it cannot spend above that line. We call that line, that taxation line, the limit of barter. So we then go to money. We say money is when government exercises a legal monopoly over the medium of exchange. Government does not impose spending limits based on the amount of taxes it receives. So in other words, it is not pretending that line still exists when it's no longer there, because government is issuing the money and it is not limited by the amount of taxes. So government becomes the currency provider and not a mere user of the currency. We look at the same graph. We've got the dollars or pounds on the y-axis, time on the x-axis, and we look at the annual receipts of taxes. Government is not constrained to spend below that line. That line, if it does exist in a budget or in a promulgation of legislation like the Growth and Stability Pact in the EU, where they're limited to spending 3% more than their budget, or in a normal economy where they want to balance their budget, that line is a non-binding constraint. It is a self-imposed constraint. Government can always spend, with the sovereign currency, can always spend more than it makes in taxes. In fact, it does not even have to tax at all. So we look now at the cash flows. Government under barter, or when a government decides to dollarize or use another country's currency, it has to wait to receive the money from the economy or from the diaspora, where people are sending home money, or by exports. When they come in, it can um, tax those, get royalties. So it gets taxes from the government, and the amount of taxes limits how much the government can spend. That limit of barter, that limit of the amount of taxes is prevalent. Government must wait to receive money from the economy before it can spend it. However, under money, government spends first. Government has the monopoly over money. It must spend first and spend that money into the economy on a generous basis, so that that economy can then pay taxes and return the money to the government. That is why they say there are two things that are certain: debt and taxes. Taxes are the debt of money. Taxes are when money returns to its creator, to its provider. That is the debt of money. Or either when a bank lends money, or the central bank lends money, or the commercial banks lend money into an economy, they create that money. They lend money that has not existed before. We're going to look at that in the next video. And they tax that money, and when that money is taxed, and when that loan is repaid, the money is extinguished from the economy. So what happens is taxes and loan payments destroy money. When government spends and when the banks lend, that creates money. So we go back and say taxes do not fund a government with a sovereign currency, because the government must in fact spend the money into existence first before it can be taxed. Government has the monopoly over the creation of money. The economy cannot create the money. Firms and households cannot create the currency. They will be put in jail for forgery and be put in jail for a very long time. Government must be careful not to reimpose the limits of barter on itself by trying to balance the budget. Money was created so that government could spend more than it could spend before it makes that money by taxes, before it generates taxes. Government with a sovereign currency can never run out of its own money, because it is the provider of the money. it does not need to get money from the economy because it can simply print it or make it by journal entry, by an accounting entry. Let's look at a few examples of this principle in operation. We look at the memoirs of Benjamin Franklin. As early as 1723, he says, the colony of Pennsylvania showed that it was possible for money to be issued by the government in the place of taxes without causing inflation. Money was printed and circulated there and everywhere. No taxes needed to be collected in Pennsylvania from 1723 to 1750 as a result. The Bank of England pressured the British Parliament to pass the Currency Act. So we look at here at the great state of Pennsylvania, which was then a colony because it's before the Wars of Independence. And so in Pennsylvania, they decided to they didn't need taxes. They didn't want to raise any taxes because they didn't need taxes, and that colony prospered because it injected money into the economy on a regular basis, and this was the cause of prosperity. Only when the Coinage Act or the Currency Act was passed in 1764 by the House of Commons, this prohibited the colonies from producing their own currencies or their own money. They had to rely on what was the pound sterling, which was the pound actually created in England, because you had different pounds, but the pound sterling was the one that was created in London by the Bank of England. And because of this, Benjamin Franklin believed that it caused sudden poverty. So between 1765 and 1775, in that decade, the living standards in pre-independent America drastically went down. The streets were filled with the unemployed, and this triggered the Revolutionary War, the American War of Independence. This was the cause that Benjamin Franklin, time after time in his memoirs, his autobiography, says caused the Revolutionary War. It wasn't the taxes. The taxes was just a rallying point, and the Boston Tea Party was just an event in that, but it wasn't because of taxes without representation. This was more what they said to the masses, but it's because of the poverty that was done by removing the currency away from the colonies and the commonwealths. Okay, so we look again at Benjamin Franklin, because he wrote a lot about money. Okay, so now he's talking about the Continentals. Benjamin Franklin says, this effect of paper currency is not understood in England, and indeed the whole is a mystery to the politicians, how we could have been able to continue a war for 4 years without money, and how we could pay with paper that had no previously fixed fund appropriated specially to redeem it. This currency is a wonderful machine. It performs its office when we issue it, and when we are obliged to issue a quantity excessive, it pays itself by depreciation. The American War of Independence was won without any taxes. As Stephen Zarlanger, the head of the American Monetary Institute, says that the Continentals, one, gave America a country, and the greenbacks made sure they kept that country. It was all about money. As America's most famous son, Thomas Paine, who's also it's America's greatest son and father of the revolution, Thomas Paine, says that the Continental currency was the cornerstone to the War of Independence, to America gaining self-determination and independence. We look at more examples of the need not to tax, that government can go it along without taxes. Look at the United States. There was no income tax from 1776 until 1917. This is from 1776 is the Declaration of Independence. 1917 is during the World War, and this is after the Federal Reserve began operations on the 1st of January 1914. Immediately you have World War I. But there was no income tax until 1917. We're not going to digress and go into why they brought in an income tax, but there was no need to. We know that the U.S. was in ruins in 1865 after the Civil War, but by 1876, a mere 11 years later, at the centennial celebrations, which was there was a big fair that was held in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. America was the most advanced country. There were things that were displayed there for the first time. You had the telephone, you had the typewriter, you had the modern precursor to electricity, the dynamo, and there were a lot of inventions. I think you can look it up. I think Wikipedia does note some of the inventions. And by 1898, which is the Spanish-American War, America was a world power. They defeated Spain and gained the Philippines. All this, and by 1914, we can even add, America was the main power in the world. It was the world power. It was even stronger than the United Kingdom, than Britain, with all its colonies. All these things were accomplished without an income tax. We can also look at the United States today. They have a $2.5 million deficit on a daily basis. In other words, they spend almost $3 billion more than they take in taxes. And this is not inflationary. The U.S. has always run budget deficits from inception, and the few times that it hasn't run budget deficits, it has led to depressions, recessions, and other crises. We look at World War I. We look at the spending by the different countries that were involved there. We look at the percentage spent on the war that was funded by taxes. Germany had no taxes, and they basically fought most of the other countries. France only had 6% taxes. Great Britain, 22%. So whether you spend on guns or on butter, or no matter what you spend it on, if it's on warfare, it's of no consequence. It's all the same. It does not need to be financed by taxes. Let's look at the problems with the approach of saying that we need to fund, that budgets need to be balanced, and that government must be funded by taxes. We go back to the Great Depression. In these days, in those days, there was a gold standard, and it was between the world wars. So how the gold standard worked was you used your own currency for domestic purposes, but for exports, then you would use gold, which was the recognized medium of exchange between countries. And the thinking then was, if you spent if you spent more than you made in taxes, gold would leave your shores. That was the disciplinary effect of the gold standard. As a result, in 1929, when the stock market crashed, the banks stopped lending, credit vanished, as credit vanishes in a crisis. And this notion was there in the countries, in the major countries, that the governments could not incur deficits. So they didn't up the spending. The banks normally create most of the money in an economy, and they stopped lending. They stopped putting money into the economy. The country started collapsing. There was poverty. There were people on the streets, and government had no tools in their toolbox to deal with it, because what they needed to do was to deficit spend, was to spend more than they made in taxes. In fact, they should deficit spend all the time. The Great Depression only started easing after initially France in 1931 moved off the gold standard and started deficit spending. Soon afterwards, Great Britain and the USA moved, and the crisis was ameliorated, and basically the worst years of the Depression were then over. And as a result of this crisis and the lack of understanding of money, John Maynard Keynes, who had written a book on money in 1930, thought that he had left over an important aspect. So he went along and wrote what's called the general theory, which is the general theory of employment, interest, and money. He wanted governments to know that if there was a crisis, if unemployment was high and the economy was bad, that government could deficit spend. He was worried that there could be a second dark age, because that's how the world slipped into the dark ages. Rome, after defeating Hannibal, forgot to reinstate their currency. Instead, they went on to silver and then on to gold. And as a result, the Roman Empire declined and fell. And when the whole world was on gold, you then had the Dark Ages. This is part of it is reported in the Silver Commission, which was a monetary commission of the United States government in 1876, which was led by Alexander Delmar, who's probably the best monetary historian. And it looked into that. We don't know what sources they used to for the numbers they used in that report, but basically that contraction of the economy from moving from money to gold triggered the Dark Ages. And they have feared that had, for example, France not gone off the gold standard in 1931 and the other countries following suit, they might have triggered a new dark age. They wanted to make sure that governments did not do that in the future. So when Paul Samuelson came to write his book on economics, that was used for about 40 years in major universities, he had a phrase in there, and which he called the paradox of thrift, which he basically said if the government is unlike an individual, which is what we've said all along, that when times are bad, an individual has to be thrifty. He has to save. But the government is unlike that, in that when times are bad, the economy is bad and unemployment is high, the government must deficit spend. It must spend its way to prosperity. So when we look at our graph, that line, if the government spends below that line, it creates surplus. But when it spends above the limits of barter, it's a deficit. And the government must deficit spend. When we look at this graph as well and compare to what Samuelson says, there is no paradox there. It is simply what must happen. Because we can't have a paradox in a theory. The theory can never be different from the practice. Because theoria is from the Greek word, theory is from the Greek word theoria, which basically means a look in. The theory must describe what happens in practice. If there's a paradox or the theory is different from practice, then our theory is wrong and we must correct our theory. What Samuelson and Keynes described is saying that that line, that deficit line, that barter line when we're using money is not a real line. It's not a binding constraint. It is a non-binding constraint. It is a self-imposed constraint. And we should spend above it. Whether the economy is bad or whether the economy is good, we should always incur deficits. We should always be putting money into the economy. The point that overrides these things is that whenever government acts as a mere user of the currency, it limits itself to taxes. It will lead to what happened with Rome. There will be a decline and fall unless the country is producing oil or something else in the good years of oil, where the price is good. The failure of Rome was because it failed to reinstitute its currency after the Punic Wars against Carthage. The French Revolution was there because the French, after the Mississippi bubble, failed to reconstitute its currency. The Mississippi bubble was caused by John Law, who a lot of people think was probably a British agent. So hopefully in this presentation you've been able to see that money was created to provision government. So tax is no longer provision government, and money was created to overcome. The limit of barter was created to overcome the limit of being constrained by taxes. Thank you very much for listening, and If you have any comments and suggestions, please note them.